Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is Chapter 63 of Gunnerkrigg Court, The Shadow Men.
Hello there.
So this is a direct continuation of the previous chapter in which Juliet and Arthur make themselves known to Kat.
So one thing I noticed when I was reading these chapters and this book is that, to me, like in my mind, the events of the Jean chapters and the events at the end of Volume 7 seem very far apart, but I'm noticing that the chapters really flow together as one story, and they kind of charge right into it.
Yeah, so with all the events that are happening in this book, I kind of did want them to run into each other because they were, well, a lot of the things were direct consequences of the stuff that happened with Jean, but also did coincide with a lot of the plot points that I wanted to bring back into the plot right now, such as the stuff with Juliet and Arthur. So I did try and plan this book out a little bit differently.
I wanted to ask about the Shadow Men. My impression of them as an organization within the court is that they're kind of X-Files-y. Is that the correct assessment of them?
Yeah, that's the kind of feel that I wanted to give with them, but at this point we really don't know much about them except for what Juliet has said and what we've seen in the previous chapters. And
it does seem like Juliet and Arthur are kind of atypical examples of them, since as they go into this chapter, their goals are a little bit different.
Yeah, that's right. We'll find out that what they're doing is really against anything that the court and the Shadow Men would want them to do, but they're actually using the resources of this secret organization to keep their activities a secret, and so they've come to Kat looking for help, but they are also in the position that they can help Kat with her work and keeping that secret.
It does seem like the higher-ups of the court that we never really see, that their influence and power is something that's only hinted to. So did you want to bring in these Shadow Men to show how Kat can possibly fly under their radar?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly why they're doing this at this point. So it's kind of implied that a lot of the surveillance and covert operations that the court might do involves these Shadow Men characters. And so for Kat and Annie to continue any sort of secret operations themselves, it would be pretty helpful to have some of the people who are actually in charge of monitoring activity in the court on their side. And we pretty quickly see what it is that Juliet and Arthur actually want from Kat, because it turns out that they are a human and robot couple.
So Kat's pretty excited about this, which is very cute, but when it was her a few chapters ago thinking mistakenly that a robot might have written her a love letter, she was a lot less enthusiastic about it. Is that because her feelings have changed, or is there something else going on?
Well, I wanted to give the impression that every once in a while the students might get a robot giving them a love letter, and that happens often enough that the school has told them to just ignore it, because there is something inherent about the robots that causes them to do that sort of thing. And so when Kat thought that she was getting a letter from Bobby, she was more disappointed than anything, and she assumed that she would just be going through the motions of having to reject him and feel a bit sorry for herself that, the one time that she gets a love note and it's just from some crummy robot. But in this instance, she's come face to face with a woman who has sincerely returned the feelings to a robot, and she's more fascinated with the situation since it's pretty much against regulation.
Do boys ever get love letters from robots, or are the robots kind of just copying the Diego Jean thing?
No, the boys would sometimes get them too.
That's cute.
The robots are pretty much genderless, though they generally identify as male.
In this sequence, we see Juliet and Arthur growing up together. Is there anything you wanted specifically to show about the way they grew up with this?
Yeah, I did want to show that Juliet pretty much had a regular life as she was growing up, and she had friends and relationships and stuff. And I guess I did that because I wanted to not give the impression that she might have felt that she had no other option, perhaps, than eventually deciding to start dating Arthur. It was more that he was pretty much a lifelong friend that she eventually fell in love with. And I thought that was an important enough notion that I wanted to clear up. And also it was just kind of fun to draw them at different stages in their life and how they might have grown up together in the court. And kind of also give the impression that perhaps some of the students might know these robots that help them out during their school life over a fairly long term.
Is it normal for the robots to cycle through bodies at this pace?
In my mind, I think that it is not uncommon, but not really something that is done very often, but it's probably something that they could do if ever they need to. But it would definitely be a marker of growth for any one individual robot if they've cycled through different bodies that had perhaps different functions throughout their life. And it could be that they're in different situations where they need a body that performs differently for whatever their current task is. So they might need a stronger body for heavy lifting jobs, or a body that allows them to enter dangerous situations and things like that. And I wanted to give the impression that the body that Arthur currently has is probably one that is optimized for his work with the Shadow Men, like we've seen in a previous chapter that he has surveillance equipment built into it. And I just thought it was a fun way of just showing the robot in different stages of his life.
What's interesting to me about a lot of this discussion is even though the court seems so almost like oppressively controlling, it does seem like the court itself is almost like something that they don't even understand because the robots seem outside of their control.
Yeah, some of the robots definitely are outside of the control, especially these Seraph robots. They have been around perhaps a lot longer than any of the other people in the court. And because the court is so large and so old, there are definitely areas that have either been forgotten about or processes that just work without any intervention. And so there are some aspects of the court that kind of function autonomously, and that is part of what the robots are for. They're like inhabitants of the court that lead their own lives, really. And even though the administration of the court would never admit it, the robots really are like their own species that exist and live in the court. And they're generally left to their own devices. But the Shadow Men are there to keep an eye on any anomalous behavior.
It does seem like now that Kat and Annie are getting older, adults are trusting them more with just a little bit of information about how the court really works and how it can kind of be dangerous to them.
I guess a little bit that it's more the fact that Kat's technology is developed to a point where Juliet wanted to step in, and their colleague later on, as we'll find out.
Do you think you'll ever go more deeply into why Juliet wants to leave the court, or is it just a general thing of wanting the freedom to leave the court?
Yeah, it's just that they generally just want to leave and live their own life away from the court. And that will be something that I'll deal with directly later on. But for now, Juliet and Arthur have made their proposition and they've let Kat know what they'd like help with. And we get to the next part of the chapter where Annie comes along and discovers that not only is Kat working with her father, but they seem to be getting along just fine.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why you chose to show Kat and Tony's relationship deepening in this way where we don't really get to see how that happened?
Oh yeah, no, I did that very much intentionally because I wanted it to seem like just the most unexpected and weirdest thing and weirdest development to have happened in Annie's point of view especially. Because like Annie points out, there's nobody who's been more angry at Tony than Kat has. And then suddenly one day, almost out of the blue, she comes and sees that not only is Kat with him, but like laughing and joking and working very closely with him. So I wanted it to seem extremely shocking and kind of weird, especially from Annie's point of view. And it's kind of a little bit of a setup for what we'll see later, which is that when Tony is one-on-one with somebody, he's really a very different person. So much so that it seems that he's able to make somebody who absolutely hates him into his friend, and he has some sort of charm that allows him to do that so far Annie and the readers have just not seen or had any indication of.
Well, I think it's a good way to keep things from Annie's point of view because she can be such a distant character, but when we also feel like surprised and left out from Tony, it really puts us in her shoes. And I also think it's both sad but kind of reassuring to see that she knew how Kat felt the whole time and wasn't just kind of blissfully ignorant of that.
That's kind of something that I tried to show as well. So whenever anybody criticized Tony, it would seem like Annie is just brushing it off and not really aware of how people are. But here, I wanted to show outright that Annie knew all along that everybody hates her dad because she knows what he's like and she is not oblivious to the rest of the world. And she's chosen to not only accept that, but also accept the fact that everybody just hates him. And I wanted it to seem a little bit tragic that what is normal for Annie is that everybody just dislikes her dad. And so this is really throwing her for a loop here. The fact that her best friend is actually kind of palling around with her dad.
Well, when I was reading this chapter, I couldn't help but think about the Fire Spike chapter, where she gets into that argument with Renard and says things like, well, you're just jealous because, I know my father and mother truly loved each other. But it made me wonder if she only said that to kind of hurt him, because it does seem here that she's in much more turmoil about it than she seemed to be in that chapter.
Well, not exactly. She does say that she was sure that they always loved each other because she was there during their relationship in the hospital, so she knew how close they were, even if she was never really party to Tony's feelings directly. But this change in Kat's behavior is so shocking to Annie that she's now just starting to really question all that.
Did you mean to have kind of a light tone with this conversation too?
Yeah, I kind of did. I didn't want Annie to seem too distraught. I wanted to couch it in a little bit of humor. Because what we're going to find out is that the big secret behind why Tony and Surma eventually did get together is going to be the most mundane reason of all, and that is that they just fell in love.
So, before we finish the chapter, I wanted to mention that I remember when this chapter was coming out, people seemed to feel very betrayed at Kat's sudden change of opinion on Tony. And part of it, I think, is I do think that when you read the chapters involving Tony, it's much easier to get to this point than when you're not thinking about the reader reaction and how I think readers really built Tony into something that ultimately he isn't, and then seems sort of disappointed that he wasn't the villain that they thought he was going to be. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I guess, I mean, that is kind of what I wanted. I wanted it to be very strange that Kat, the person who seems to have hated Tony the most so far, is now suddenly on the other side. And I wanted that to be kind of not only shocking to Annie, but also shocking to the readers. And so it's almost like Kat is betraying the readers in some way. And with the updating schedule of the story, which is fairly slow when it's updating online, people who have been with the story for years now have basically been building up Tony as this monster in their heads, and this entire time being squarely on Kat's side in the assumption that Tony is just some huge jerk. But what we're in the process of finding out now is that not only is there more to Tony's story, but it's not quite as easy as just whether he's a good guy or a bad guy. And so in this little sequence and then the next chapter, and from this point on, it's also Annie who has to learn that there is more to Tony than what she may have thought of originally.
But it also isn't that he is this great guy that she never understood. It's more like...
Oh, he's just a guy who's made mistakes, some very terrible mistakes. And for some readers, he would be irredeemable. And really, that is the position that Kat was in too. But again, Kat has gone through such a big change here that it's almost shaking Annie's worldview. That there must be something going on that she's not privy to, that, like, say, Tony has done something to Kat to make her suddenly think that he's a good guy or whatever. But we'll see that it's nothing so grandiose as that. It's actually just that Tony is a very strange man and acts very differently when he's around different people.
I think that if you were to take Tony as a metaphor for like a real world situation, it would basically be just a guy who completely checked out of his daughter's life because of his grief over losing his wife, which isn't great parenting, but it's also like the solution to that would be so they reconnect and make an effort to do so. And so really trying to connect and understand each other is the best thing for them to be doing right now.
Yeah, I would agree with all that, but also just make the comment that in the real world, you might have a situation where a parent has been estranged from a child for a while, or a loved one has gone through a period of grief and so seemingly has checked out of the family for a while, and then come back and reconnected. And in the real world, that is not an irredeemable situation. But presenting that here in fiction, I think it's very easy for a character to be completely written off for doing something that has really hurt the main character, the person who the readers would be identifying with most. So, all in all, Tony is not really meant to be seen as just a good person. But I definitely wanted to explore this entire situation of Annie and her dad's relationship, which is why it was not really important to show how it was that he was able to get Kat on his side, for example. Because we will see a bit of a different side of Tony in the next chapter, with the understanding that everything that happens in the next chapter is being conveyed to Annie through Anya. And that's really been the only way that Annie has ever known that there was a different side to her father. It's almost like secondhand information about hearing how he's actually a decent guy. And so it's something that she's not really seen directly. And that is basically what this bonus page is. It's Anya letting Annie and us know that she will be explaining what she meant. And that is the end of the chapter. So come back again for chapter 64, Get Lost.
Cool beans.
Cool beans.